Well, I'm going to go out on a limb here. A pretty thick and sturdy limb, but a limb nonetheless, and guess that this particular parable of Jesus is one that most of us have encountered before. You don't have to spend a lot of time in church to hear the parable of the talents. It's one that has a fairly straightforward and easy message, so we tell it a lot. It's about God's generosity to us and our responsibility to do something with it. Pretty easy. Actually, the main theme that Jesus is going for here is reinforced when we see it in the larger context of Matthew's gospel. This is part of a big speech right near the end. Jesus' last of his big speeches in Matthew before his crucifixion and resurrection. This parable is the end of a trio of parables, all about kind of the same thing. There's the faithful and unfaithful servant, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, and then the talents, all about God's generosity, our responsibility. And then it directly leads into this passage we all know pretty well about the last judgment, where God separates all the human beings out into the sheep and the goats according to their deeds, what they did with what they were given, and their reward or punishment is based on that. So we know what's going on here. It's a story about God's incredible generosity to us and to the world. And Jesus is telling us in no uncertain terms the depth and the seriousness of our responsibility to do something with it, not just for ourselves, but to make the world a better place. Okay, we know that. That's what Jesus is doing. And so we've probably all heard sermons on this before, stretching that quick lesson out into 20 minutes or so. And I could stand here and do that today, and we'd all be bored to tears. So instead of preaching the same sermon we've all heard, I want to do something a little different today. Given that we know what Jesus is doing, what his main message is in this parable, I'd like for us to just drop down into the world of the parable that Jesus is creating for us here. And walk around in that world a little bit and wonder together. To ask some questions together about what might have happened if one or two details had gone a little bit differently in the story. Just to wonder what if together. Does that sound good? Okay, your silence is implying consent. I'm going to assume that's good. All right. So in the world of the parable, we have a very rich man with a lot of assets. Let's call him Dave. And Dave has got 3 servants that handle his business for him. Let's just, for the sake of argument, call these servants Alvin, Simon, and Theodore. Now, Alvin, Simon, and Theodore are good, faithful servants. They do Dave's business. And one day, they're just sitting around, minding their own business, making up a song about how they want hula hoops for Christmas. And then out of nowhere, Dave shows up and says, "Hey, I'm going on a long journey. I've liquidated all my assets, and so here to each of you is a very massive check, a large amount of money that's measured in a unit known as talents." That's it. He just says, "All right, I'm off. Here you go. Bye." That's all he does. Kind of strange. All right, but let's go on. We know that each of the servants take their check, their various amounts of talents, and they go about doing their own business. So Alvin, he's very sporty and athletic in nature, so he takes his 5 talents and he invests them in a brand new NFL franchise. Great investment. That stuff prints money. So he doubles his investment really quickly. Good for him. Simon, he's very science and tech-oriented. So he invests his 2 talents in the latest social media app for our phones. And why there needs to be another new social media app, we have no idea, but he does it anyway. Good for him. Doubles his money. Great. But then there's Theodore. Theodore is not sporty and bold like Alvin. He's not smart and savvy like Simon. Theodore, he's kind of timid. kind of cautious. We don't really know why, but he is. It could be that he's the youngest of the three siblings, and having these two big personalities as older brothers kind of stunted his growth. Or maybe Theodore's being very pragmatic. He looks at this and says, I only got one talent here. I've got much less margin for error with investing, so he plays it safe. Or maybe Theodore sees Dave a little more clearly than the other two guys do. I mean, after all, when the master comes back, his excuse is, well, I did this because I know you're a hard man, harsh. I know that you sow where you don't reap and gather where you don't scatter. He knows Dave is tough, and if he messes up, he's in real trouble. What if Alvin and Simon's investments had gone south? They lose everything, and then when Dave comes back, Theodore is all of a sudden the hero of the story for having something left. That's what happens in the story. And we know eventually Dave comes back. And Alvin and Simon's boldness and entrepreneurial spirit is rewarded. And Theodore's cautiousness is rebuked. And so we're left to wonder why. Why is it that Alvin and Simon know what to do and Theodore doesn't? I mean, is investing your master's assets somewhere in that servant training manual and Theodore just skipped that chapter? Maybe. Is there something innate to their personalities that inevitably lead them to succeed or fail? Very possible. Could it be that Dave is a really poor manager for not giving instructions and just leaving it to the whims of these guys? Also a possibility. We don't really know. The parable doesn't answer those questions for us. All we know is that each of these individual guys took what they were given, went out on their own, and succeeded or failed. But what if they didn't? What if this moment where they're handed the money went a little differently? What if when Dave shows up and puts these huge checks in these guys' hands and says, see you later, and once Alvin, Simon, and Theodore recover from the shock of this, they didn't just get up and go on their own separate ways, they stayed together. They said, wow, look at what we've been given. This doesn't belong to us. This belongs to Dave, our master. Let's sort this one out together. What if they pooled their resources and they worked together to try to make more money with it? That might have been good because their own natural tendencies could have balanced each other out. I mean, Alvin, he's bold. He's ready to go. But that might lead him to make some kind of really rash decision, something that, in hindsight isn't a good idea and lose all the money. And Theodore's cautiousness could kind of pull him back and say, hey, let's think about this. Their own natural gifts and skills could have combined to make something better than, as a whole, than the individuals. Or what if Alvin and Simon then looked at their size check and then Theodore's and say, wow, we've been given a lot more to work with here than he has. Maybe because we've been given more, not because of anything about us, just because we were. That gives us a responsibility to him. So let's pool our resources and work together. What if they decided that none of them succeeds unless they all succeed? To share this whole journey, the struggles, the failures, and ultimately the success that they enjoy as a group together. Because again, whose money is it they're working with in the first place? Their own? Nope. Someone else's. It's their master's. What if they decided that they were stronger together? What if by pooling their resources, they unleashed some incredible creative potential that would not have been possible each on their own? And when the master came back, he saw what they'd done, and they'd not just doubled the investment, it had been even more. Something greater than what any of them could have done on their own. What if the story had gone that way? Pondering those what ifs in this parable, hanging out in the world of this parable, leads us then to ponder some what ifs in our own world. What if? What if more of us looked beyond our own portfolios and our own individual or family successes and said, hey, wait a second. What if what I bring to the table can benefit and complement what others bring to the table in various amounts? What if we as a community might be stronger and better and more productive and successful with all that God has given us? If we don't just rely on our own gifts and talents, what if we did it together? What if? You know, in our own church community, for a number of years, we've been batting about this idea of a child care center to really cater to lower income families that can't afford child care. And having 7 of your own kids, I can tell you child care is expensive. And when we built this sanctuary in this new section of the building, we even designed that children's area downstairs with that in mind. But recently, as we have deepened our relationships with Johnson Elementary and the Hard Bargain neighborhood, a couple of folks have started to wonder, well, you know what? What if we did that, but we didn't have to house it in our own building on our own turf? What if we looked at the resources there, right there in the neighborhoods we want to serve? And we combined our own resources and our efforts with theirs and dreamed up a new creative possibility by looking beyond ourselves, going it alone, and saying, what if we did it as a larger community? Those conversations are just in these real preliminary stages, but you know, some exciting possibilities are beginning to emerge just from that one simple question. What if? What if? As many of you all know, my family has been involved in the ministry of foster care for a number of years. And we've been on hiatus for a little while. We welcomed our son Jonah into the world. And for a while now, we've been thinking and praying about, God, do you want us to get back into this? If so, how? And as we've been thinking through this, the struggle we keep running up against is that while we had foster children in our home, we often felt like we didn't have much of a support system, a community of people who were with us, who knew what this journey was like, how hard it can be, and how wonderful it can be. We often felt like we were going it alone, and there was just a ton of burden all on us. That's kind of been our obstacle. But a week ago, as Lenore was preaching, and she was challenging all of us to say, well, what seeds of faith does God want us to plant here at Christ UMC? My wife Jessica was sitting there in the pew, and she started thinking, wait a second, what if? What if instead of going it alone just as one family, there was a group of families here at the church that all got trained and certified together as foster families and existed as that community of support for one another? To have regular play dates with the kids in our homes, to provide babysitting for one another when folks have to go to trainings or just when parents need a date night off. What if this community was there for one another, going through that same journey and understanding on a deep level how hard it can be, because the DCS system is really complicated. There's often a lot of setbacks, but also sharing the celebrations, the beauty and the joy of what happens when you open your home. This has been rolling around our minds for just a couple of days now, but we're starting to wonder, what if? What if we looked beyond our own individual family and invited others into the journey? What if? What if Alvin, Simon, and Theodore had looked beyond their own portfolios, their own standing individually in front of their master, and said, hey, guys, we're in this together. We all succeed or we all fail as a group. Because for gosh sakes, these checks that have just been put in our hands don't really belong to us. They belong to our master, who's graciously shared this with us. What if our own gifts and talents and expertises actually complement one another and will be stronger and more productive as a whole than we could ever be by ourselves? What if they remembered who it is they're working for in the first place and went about it together? I know that's not how the parable goes in this version in Matthew's gospel. But at the same time, it sounds a lot like the kind of thing Jesus would want us to do. Amen?